Hello, my name is Joseph Bush. I'm the founder of and principal consultant at Taxonomy Strategies based in Washington, D.C. I'm going to present a brief talk about governance of knowledge organization versus governance of knowledge management. First, I'll talk about some of the general characteristics of knowledge organization and knowledge management. Then I'll present a high-level model I call the 4 pillars of governance, and discuss how knowledge organization and knowledge management would be characterized in this model. And then finally, I'll provide a brief summary. So, on this first slide, I want to make the point that there are some differences between knowledge organization and knowledge management. Knowledge organization, in my opinion, is primarily concerned with the definition of how we are going to tag content assets so that they are accurately categorized. The main use case for this activity is knowledge organization, is broadly for access and discovery, or search. On the other hand, I think knowledge management is primarily concerned with the curation of assets in order to provide some sort of organizational value, and that value is normally defined in terms of some sort of strategic use of those assets, and typically talked about in the context of sharing knowledge. So, knowledge management is more concerned with the curation of assets for the sharing and application of knowledge. One of the things that I think is interesting about knowledge organization versus knowledge management is that they reflect different activities in an organization, and that they're often carried out by different and sometimes competing groups within an organization. To start with, I'd observe that I don't think you can have knowledge management without first having knowledge organization. That is, you have to have stuff to share, and it needs to be described and categorized in a way that's useful before you can really share it. But then, interestingly, knowledge management applications provide new requirements that can change the way that you decide to organize knowledge or assets. So, the two activities have an impact and inform each other in a virtuous cycle. We might also look at these activities on a maturity continuum. In this context, knowledge organization could be viewed as an earlier stage of information management maturity, and knowledge management as a more mature stage. This interaction between them might be viewed as an even more mature stage. The point is that while I'm suggesting a duality between knowledge organization and knowledge management, they really operate on a continuum, and there's really some blurring between the two activities, and a lot of interaction between them as well. I'm trying to give you something to think about. This is a bit of a thought experiment presentation. Let's move to the model that I call the 4 pillars of governance. I'll give a brief explanation of each of these pillars, and then we'll look at how knowledge organization and knowledge management could be described in the context of this model. Value statements are statements about the overall goals and objectives of an application or activity. In this first pillar, you need to describe what it is that you are trying to accomplish and why. What are the benefits to the organization? The second pillar is roles and responsibilities, which describes the kinds of things that need to be decided in order to obtain those goals and objectives. The third pillar is the policies and procedures, which are the definitions of the processes required to support the decisions that then enable and support those goals and objectives. And finally, the fourth pillar is communications, which is concerned with clearly explaining the definitions of the processes that describe the decisions that enable the goals and objectives. These pillars are related to each other. They have a top-down or bottom-up relationship to each other. This is a construct that I think is useful to look at some of the similarities and some of the differences between knowledge organization and knowledge management. So let's turn to knowledge organization governance. What are some of the key goals and objectives that are associated with knowledge organization? As I suggested before, there is this big use case that is called search. The objective behind organizing content, developing metadata and taxonomy, or controlled vocabulary schemes is to be able to improve search and other types of things that are related to it, including the ability to measure and obtain benefits that would be related to search. One of the big objectives that I would point to is the ability to facilitate complete and consistent content tagging. Because it's one thing to set up a scheme for categorizing content, but is only going to meet its goals if you can get that to be done in a complete and consistent way. So, the goals of knowledge organization are to improve search by tagging content in a complete and consistent way. In terms of the roles and responsibilities, what are the kinds of things that need to be decided? Well, we need to decide what that tagging is going to be. What are going to be the fields? Which ones are going to be required and which ones optional? We need to decide whether or not there's going to be controlled values that are associated or required for a field, and what vocabularies those should be. If we are going to use a controlled vocabulary, we need to decide what the gold standard is going to be for that vocabulary and how we make sure that only those values get used, and that those values get used correctly. So, by making these decisions, we enable the knowledge organization goals and objectives. What then do we need to define as a result of those decisions? We need to define the add, edit, and delete process for the metadata fields or tags and controlled vocabulary terms that we are going to have, how we are going to populate them, and what are going to be the rules of the road or editorial guidelines. The policies and procedures focus on describing those decisions that are going to support and enable the goals and objectives of knowledge organization. Finally, explaining and communicating what all of these things are, communicating these definitions, the decisions, and the overall objectives of what needs to be done in the context of knowledge organization is required. To summarize, with knowledge organization, the focus is on search and complete and consistent tagging. And these are the pillars that are needed to support these types of goals and objectives. Turning to knowledge management, the overall goals and objectives are all organizationally focused. They're not focused simply on having good search, they're concerned with organizational outcomes, measuring them, and obtaining certain benefits. In terms of roles and responsibilities, what are the kinds of things that need to be decided? Well, we need to decide what are the criteria for choosing applications and services and evaluating them based on whether they are likely to obtain those goals and objectives. What needs to be defined in order to enable those decisions to be implemented so that we can add, evaluate, and improve the applications. In particular, in order for knowledge management applications to work, we need to curate assets. We need to define processes for adding, editing, and deleting them from applications. And then from a communications perspective, we need to be able to explain all of these things clearly, both to the people who are carrying this out, as well as those who are going to be using and evaluating knowledge management applications. So we need to be able to explain what the procedures are that have been defined, that support the decisions that have been made, that enable the goals and objectives of knowledge management. To summarize, with knowledge management, there is a focus on strategic organizational outcomes and effective content curation. And these are the pillars that are needed to support these types of goals and objectives. Okay, so in summary, knowledge organization governance is focused on metadata fields and values and how to obtain complete and consistent tagging of assets. Whereas knowledge management government, I think, is focused much more on the curation of assets and how to obtain organizational value from them so that we might say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's very focused on organizational values as opposed to knowledge organization, which is focused a lot more on the metadata and taxonomy and how we get the tagging on the content items in the first place. I hope this short talk has provided some ideas for everyone to think about, and I'm happy to answer any questions.